jaysanalysis.com. It's this time we're back discussing the next Platonic dialogue, which is Charmides. And as we get into this, you're going to find that Charmides is not the dialogue that most people expect it to be. They're usually surprised and taken aback a bit at what goes on at the beginning of the dialogue. And I'm sitting here reading this and thinking, karma, chameleon. And you'll understand why that's the case here in a minute. This discussion is a little bit different than what we've seen so far in Phaedo or Crito or the Apology. This is not a position or a statement from Socrates where he's necessarily trying to convince the opponent with certainty of his own position. He's going to do something a little bit different here and try to get his young friend to not just accept what he's been told by others, but to question it. And that's really the main point of this dialogue. And so the dialogue will center around the question of what is, in the Greek, sophrosine, translated as generally temperance, self-control, etc. So we begin with a discussion of the relative, the cousin of Chrysius, who is a beautiful young boy, we're told. And Chrysius brags to Socrates that his young cousin is not just a strapping young lad, but also somewhat of a budding philosopher. And so here we get into the subject of Greek love, as it's called. We know that in Plato there's Platonic love between friends, there's eros, which is erotic, and so forth, different types of love. And this is the notorious man-boy love type of situation that we know from Greek culture, passed down. The progressives, quote-unquote, love to cite this as why we need to have completely openly gay and pedophiliac relationships. So definitely, in my estimation, my beliefs, is something that we would like to reject from Greek culture and Greek dialogues, Greek philosophy, so forth. I'm going to skip over the discussions of how beautiful the naked boy is. What's his name? Charmides, excuse me. Because, yeah, let's just skip that. Well, I mean, maybe we shouldn't skip it. I mean, it is, I guess, relevant from the perspective of Greek views of the body, of beauty, because surprisingly for Greek thought in Plato, they have this dialectic of flight from this world due to it being in flux, being subject to continual change into the realm of the forms. Yet at the same time, there is a participatory view of particulars that they do participate in the universal forms. And so beauty, which is the telos, where it's eros, love, has a natural tendency towards the beautiful in Plato's thought. So there's then a connection between the beauty of physical form that participates in the universal form of beauty. So we can appreciate that aspect, although I'm not particularly interested in the nude male form. I suppose from a aesthetic perspective, we can appreciate it, as in it is a beautiful created thing that God made, but plumbing this for some positive aspect, I guess I see, for example, in a lot of feminist rants and blabberings that they will say things like they hate the male body, that it's gross. I've heard many say that the male member is pretty gross as well. And I think this is not the attitude that women should have, because there's nothing gross about the body as a whole functioning as a system of, kind of a microcosm of the macrocosm. Nothing created is in itself evil or, quote, gross. There may be a relative subjective sense in which we find certain things gross, but if we think back to Renaissance art with, statues of Bernini and people like that in Rome and Florence, and we think about ancient Greek views of the body, they at least had a correct sense that we don't need to see these things as in themselves wicked or disgusting. So even though later Gnostic traditions would sort of spin off of Greek influence and Far Eastern influence and believe that the physical realm, material realm was evil in itself, even though there's kind of that latent, nascent potential here in Plato for that, there is at the same time a overly indulgent view of the physical form. Why Socrates wasn't interested in the female form, something I would definitely wish was on his mind instead of the beauty of young boys, but nevertheless it is here. And we also see that when he questions Charmides, it's with the intention of getting him to think. So he says, what is temperance? Can you define it? So they go through a protracted discussion about how to define temperance and what it is. But there's also a fascinating statement about health at the beginning, where Socrates says that the whole man is the source of truly being healthy. So while certain physicians might say that, we just need to treat the symptoms, there's a fascinating statement from Plato here that he says is the reason why the cure of many diseases is unknown to physicians of Hellas is because they disregard the whole, which ought to be studied, for they can never be well unless the whole is well. So he says that the soul has to be treated just as much as the body. So you can't just treat bodily symptoms and bodily ailments without treating the spiritual aspect of man. And we see actually, I've seen articles recently in different science blogs and so forth discussing the possibility that there might be a connection between people's mental states and what their body is experiencing, or even between depression or mental states and cancer, things like that. I've known, actually in my life, I've gone to school with plenty of feminists who, had abortions and, spent their youth hating men and so forth. And of course going along with the system's recommendations for all the vaccines and drugs and pills that they need to take. And many of them I've seen end up with cancer. So is there a direct connect between feminism and cancer? Well, of course, that's not going to be PC or tolerated, but I've seen quite a few feminists get cancer. So, the mental state, I think, obviously has an effect on the body. So holistic views of health are seen here. And this is something that, of course, the Far East has always believed. we think about ancient Chinese medicine, stuff like that. They still view the man as a whole and his interconnected, his context-dependent existence, intimately connected with the rest of his environment and everyone else. So there's truth in that. And it's yet another element of Platonic thought that we can see is clearly influenced by Far Eastern ideas, as we saw before with things like transmigration of the soul and so forth in other dialogues. Plato also discusses briefly breeding, and that the nobler members of the elite here, we get the idea these are, of course, upper caste members of Athens. And he says that the two Athenian houses whose union would likely produce a better and more nobler scion than the two from which you are sprung. So there's the idea of breeding. Eugenics, of course, goes all the way back to the Greeks. It is itself a Greek word, racial hygiene. And so, in my view, we're all, on one level, eugenicists in that we tend to naturally want to pair up with or mate with the most fit, the most attractive, the best candidate of the opposite sex. That's kind of a natural desire we have. There's nothing wrong with that. So eugenics on the personal level makes sense. Obviously, if I want to reproduce, I'm going to find a woman that suits my fancy, that has, pretty high characteristics. Of course, Plato's kind of lusting after a little boy here, or Socrates is kind of lusting after a little boy here. So I don't think that fits well into the eugenics aspect of it. It might fit into the NAMBLA aspect of it, but again, the idea of racial hygiene is an ancient idea that they had noticed that, what you get from breeding animals is kind of analogous to what you get in breeding humans. The danger, I think, comes when we have a dogmatic, tyrannical, centralized state that wants to enforce, some sort of regimented breeding upon everyone. We saw that with, say, Nazi Germany. That's, of course, the danger aspect of this. But you can't, if, for example, you believe in human freedom, free will, well, you can't stop people from, mating with who they want to, right? So if somebody, for example, chooses to be discriminatory, and if they're white and they want to marry a white person, well, how can you say that that's wrong, right? Because you'd have to say, if a black person wants to marry black people, that's wrong. Well, right, nobody's going to say that. That's ridiculous and beyond PC, right? So, of course, all this PC stuff is just all ultimately about, centralized control dictating what can be done. But again, I think to be consistent, we can't tell people on an individual level that they can't be discriminating in their choices, because they're going to be, obviously. Some people like brunettes, some people like blue-eyed blondes, right? And you can't, there's no way you can have a centralized state mandate what everybody has to like. That's just insane. And that's what we see in all the dystopian books and novels. So it's important, I think, to be a little more sophisticated when it comes to the question of eugenics. Plus, on top of that, we don't even live in the older model of eugenics anymore anyway. It's not even so much about race anymore like it was, say, with the Nazi German experiment. Now it's more so about everybody being put under more of a Fabian socialist version of eugenics, where just everybody's going to be dumbed down and sterilized, right? So it's not It's no longer about this, Germanic biological view of dominance and being overlords, Teutonic overlords or something. Now it's changed into a Fabian model coming out of the Royal Society, which is going to try to stop everybody from reproducing, except for the 0.0001%. And it's no longer so much racial as it is now, having moved into biotech and the transhumanist stuff. Or transhumanism is kind of the new version of eugenics. So the system, of course, still promotes a lot of the racial strife, racial issues, just to keep everybody, fractured and fighting and dealing with, focused on those issues, while at the same time, the technocratic elite have moved on beyond the racial eugenics into, biotech eugenics, transhumanism. That said, it's not like the racial aspect is totally gone. We see this year with Ferguson and all that kind of crazy stuff. So, but again, at the same time, and people want to call me out, that's fine. I'm just being honest and being consistent here. You can't tell people on an individual level that they, can't be discriminatory. It's just crazy. And people tend to go, like it usually attracts to like. And that's just a fact. I mean, birds want to mate with birds. Different breeds of dogs tend to prefer, dogs, right? They don't. When we look at things in nature, like an ass, when we have a mule, we have these weird intermixes that tend to not. I mean, they might have certain characteristics that are useful, like carrying luggage a long way or something like that. But when we have sterile offspring, that's a clear example of the fact that it's just a principle in nature that there are truths that surround breeding. If you, for example, let's say we had a centralized state that said you can't mate with a classically attractive female, okay, and you have to mate with somebody. Let's say fat acceptance begins to dominate, and the centralized state says that you have to mate with someone overweight. And that sounds a little bit ridiculous, but let's just say for the sake of argument that happened. The fat state, big cis. Well, most people don't want to do that, right? I mean, that again is just another illustration of that principle of individuals wanting to be able to freely choose, who they want to mate with. So, again, I got kind of off track here, but I just thought it was interesting that breeding and health and holistic views of the body came up early in this dialogue, which we wouldn't expect. He goes on, and he says, "Okay, Charmides, I want you to define temperance for me. Let's test out your philosophy skills." He's giving him a philosophy test here. And Charmides says, "Well, maybe it's quietness." And Socrates says, "No, that's no good, because there are plenty of," he says, "temperance is always good, but we can think of plenty of examples where quietness is not always good." So he says, "Well, maybe it's modesty." And then Socrates applies the same argument and says, "Well, modesty is good, but we can think of all kinds of examples where modesty is not always useful, but temperance is always useful. So we can't say temperance is modesty." And he says, well, it's minding your own business. Socrates says, well, we can think of examples where minding your own business might not be fitting in a situation, whereas temperance is always fitting. So it can't be that. So they keep going back and forth, and then Charmides thinks he's finally got kind of the gist of it. He says, I got it. The classic Greek inscription at the Oracle of Delphi, know thyself. That's what it is. That's what you're looking for, Socrates. I know what you want. You want me to say it's know thyself. And in knowing myself, I will know my limitations, and then I'll know from whom I can learn in terms of those who have more skill than me. That's what you want, isn't it? And Socrates says, no, you've missed the whole point. You've got it wrong again. And then they propose different, Charmides proposes different speculations about numbers, and he says, well, maybe it's, maybe it's like a science. Temperance is a science of wisdom. And Socrates says, no, it's not a science of wisdom. And so Charmides starts getting frustrated because he's saying, what do you want? Like every answer I give, you're arguing with me and being very difficult, and you know my nerves here. Everything I say is wrong. And this is where Charmides is a unique dialogue, because even though Socrates will kind of give an answer at the end, the gadfly of Athens, as he's called, is playing in this dialogue the role of simply the devil's advocate, if you will. He's playing just the role of the challenger. So whereas in the Apology we saw that with him going around questioning everybody in Athens, the different tradespeople, so forth, and making them all mad, he's the key insight of wisdom here is that Socrates is saying, do you understand that a person who comes and questions and challenges you is not always the annoying, interlocutor that you think? He's actually serving a role. And this is a nugget of wisdom that the philosopher has to understand, is that you have to be not just willing to be corrected or challenged, you need to want that, right? Because we can always be settled in some view that we have on something. And what Socrates' point here is to Charmides is that you've continually just believed something because you were told it. You see, Charmides, all along, you've thought that you needed to give an answer that I wanted. He said and he's saying that's your problem. Your problem is that you think that you need to answer what I expect. No, you need to think for yourself, and that's the whole point of this. That's the whole point of being the gadfly of Athens, in certain instances. Even though at times he does, give an absolute answer, what he thinks is objectively the case. Sometimes he's playing just the role of challenging the assumptions. Maybe he doesn't even have a specific answer himself, and that's kind of where Socrates will go, is that, there's an aspect of temperance or wisdom that's ineffable, that's indescribable, that's mysterious. It's not like an empirical science that we can, put under a microscope. There's something more to wisdom than that, and that's fine, that's okay. There's something apophatic about it. Like we said before, apophatic theology is the theology of negation. APOPHASIS, apophasis, knowing by unknowing, if you will. And there's something paradoxical about that, but at the same time it's sensible, because we're finite. So anytime, say, we talk about categories such as infinity, for example. Well, because we're finite and we're always referencing finite things as analogies, we're always going to be coming up short when we try to describe something like infinity. But we know infinity is a mathematical reality. It's something real. It's a objectively existing thing or mathematical concept. Yet we are obviously going to fall short anytime we try to define infinity. And so the Greek idea for these kinds of things was that it was apophatic. You could define infinity by saying, well, it's not created, right? It's not that thing. It's beyond that thing. And so in the same way, the goal of the philosopher at times is to play the prosecutor, right? It doesn't mean that he necessarily has an answer, but to play the role of challenging in order to, one, get the other person to not just accept something that because they were told it. The way the news is, the news just says something that, ISIS attacked so many villages today and blah, 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 blah. Well, is that true? The news kind of operates on this command and control perspective where you just accept it. And if Socrates were watching the news, he would ask the people in the room watching the news with him, do you know that really happened? Or is that just what you were told, right? So sometimes playing the role of the skeptic or the devil's advocate, not for the purpose of being a dickhead or just being a butt, trying to make everybody mad, but rather trying to get the other person to see that this is just something that you were told. This is just something that you grew up with, just something you accepted. Have you examined this, right? Living the examined life. That's kind of the whole ethos of what it is to be Socrates. And so even though Charmides tries to take it in the direction of meta, maybe wisdom is the science of science. Wisdom is the science of wisdom. Or, Socrates still says, maybe not, but that's not my point. He says, well, maybe it's knowing good and evil. And Socrates kind of thinks that that's probably the closest that we could get to defining temperance and whether or not wisdom is a science of sciences. Yeah, it's probably knowing good and evil. That's pretty close. But again, here the main point is what we saw similarly in the Apology. Rather than being spoon-fed something, taking the approach of questioning it and seeing, and that doesn't even necessarily mean in some sort of rationalistic, enlightenment view that, oh, well, I'm going to question, say, my religious upbringing, and if I don't get a Richard Dawkins empirical answer for every single aspect of every proposition that I've ever believed, then I don't have any reason to believe it. No, it doesn't mean that either, because that's impossible. Nobody can actually live that worldview anyway. You can't, because you can never have an empirical basis for every single thing that you believe. I mean, simple example of this, you don't have an immediate empirical experience of the past. You have a memory, but that's not the same thing as an immediate sensory experience of the past. So does that mean that we have no rational basis to believe in the past? Well, I mean, if you're going to take the radical, consistent approach of somebody like David Hume, you'd have to say, yeah, no, Hume doesn't really live that way, and he kind of, sees it as somewhat of a joke. He says, well, no, I mean, commonsensically, I believe the past happened. But if we want to be strict and logical about it and rational, you don't have any basis to believe that the past occurred. because it's not an immediate sense experience, right? So this is how stupid empiricism ends up, radical empiricism, strict empiricism ends up being. But you'll never hear Dawkins or any of those people actually try to be consistent for all of their talk of being rational and for talking of reason and logic. They're never going to be as consistent as Hume and become radical skeptics. Oh no, they are radical dogmatists. So we can see insight from Plato in that perspective too, in terms of not being spoon-fed just another position, right? So let's say you were raised with some goofy religious, perspective that you later come to reject. Well, most of the time, people that do that, they just immediately jump into the next thing, right? So they just dive into, say, well, a lot of people, well, the new atheism, that's, Dawkins, Dennett, these guys, they've got all the answers. No, that's just another spoon-fed religion that doesn't do any of what I'm trying to tell you to do, right? They don't do, and what I'm telling you to do is not accept what I say. I'm advocating doing what Socrates does, which is try to get Charmides to think and question for himself, right? So don't just hop to the next priest in a lab coat or the next guy who sounds smart. What's the proverb from Solomon? Is that a man, the first to present his case seems correct until one comes along and examines him, right? So just because something seems right, don't fall for appearances. And that's, again, one of the central tenets of Platonism. So even if you believe something firmly, don't get mad when somebody questions it, even if they're being a dickhead about it. The wise man can learn from a fool, Solomon also says. So even if you're very convinced of a position, some fool comes along and challenges you on X, Y, Z. Don't get flustered about it. Try to see how, even in a situation like that, you can learn from it. Sorry. So it's kind of, a lot of it has to do with how we approach these situations. We can learn from these situations, even if we're totally certain we're right and the opponent's completely idiotic. We can learn from that itself. That interchange, that experience itself, can teach us how the fool works, right? The thinking of the fool, and so a lot of that you see going on in Platonic dialogues too. So that concludes the Charmides, and thank you for listening to this one. And next up we have Laches and Lysis. So those are, again, more obscure dialogues, but there's nuggets of interesting stuff in the obscure Platonic dialogues as well. So check out jaysanalysis.com. If you like what you see, subscribe, and we'll have more of this to come. Thank you.